Let me hand over straight away to Caroline, Ashley, who's going to present something about the alternative methodologies.
Yes. Thanks very much, Simon. Yeah, thanks very much for that. As Simon said, trying to put some flesh on these bones of the question, what impact does business actually have in developing countries? Most of us in this room work in some way on enhancing the impact of the business sector, of companies, on developing economies, people in developing countries, on poverty reduction. But how many of us could actually say what impact our company or our corporate partner really has? We talk so much about it, but today's session is looking at how we can move forward to get a better idea of what that impact actually is. We're looking at different approaches for moving forward. We're not looking at what we know and what we don't know, but how we can take the question forward. And particularly at approaches that companies themselves can use. You may well ask, why should a company assess its development contribution? That's really for donors and charities to do because they use taxpayer money and donated money. That's true. Businesses' first responsibility is to report to shareholders, but I think the business case for companies to take action is clearly increasing. Many companies are making commitments, are trying to enhance, to boost their impact on local economies, local people, poverty reduction. So if you're trying to make something better, obviously you need the information to improve your decision making. That's what people want to do, they need the data. Beyond that, stakeholders want to know, a wide range of stakeholders from financiers, shareholders, local communities, NGOs. If companies are going to engage in that, claims are becoming a thing of the past, expenses claim a thing of the present, and evidence is needed. And finally, companies spend so much time these days on CSR reporting. As this graph shows, the number of companies engaged in CSR reporting has rocketed. But most CSR reporting tends to be page 34, says something about numbers of developing countries where we work, perhaps turnover or supply chain or volume of sales, perhaps CSR spend, and really does not have an awful lot more information on impact on development. So if companies are doing that reporting, they might as well add this very useful section of information. So I'm breaking these reasons for doing it into two broad themes. One is about improving decision making and improving performance. And the other is about proving or communicating to others what you are doing in terms of a contribution to development and poverty reduction. But pity the poor manager that is asked to report whether to the community, the CSR producer or the board on the company's impact on development. These are some of the questions that I think that poor woman or man faces. And I want to pick up on the bottom one of these, which approach do I choose? So during the meeting today we'll come back to the other ones about what's practical, what's the business case, and how is the information going to be used. So the assumption here is that this is the kind of process a company would go through. You define what you want to know and why, then you have to choose your approach, and then you secure internal agreement and you do it and you use it. So the key thing here is this middle section in the dark blue. Having a look at what exists out there, it is diverse, it is scattered, there's a real mix, but there are very broadly 4 approaches. Any categorization is vague, you're welcome to challenge it, it can always be changed, nothing is perfect. Very broadly, one approach is to do local level assessment, another is to do a footprint of the value chain, the third is to calculate the economic contribution, and the fourth is to report against a scorecard of several indicators. Those are the 4 that we're going to look at briefly and then hear speakers from their own experience. The first approach is very much at the local level. It's the kind of data it collects is about impacts on local people, on livelihoods, income, quantitative data, but also qualitative skills, institutions, capacity. It draws on stakeholder views. Stakeholders aren't just residents, they might be suppliers, retailers, entrepreneurs. It's descriptive, what, and it's also explanatory. People can look at why. And it can apply to a project, it often applies to CSR projects. This example is Diageo's Water of Life. It can also apply to a site, business at a site, and you'll hear from Anglo American about their toolbox, which applies to the mining site, or it can apply to a product, as has been done by Vodafone, where local information is aggregated up to get a view of a whole product. What does it deliver? And here are some of the outputs from the Diageo Water of Life report. It does several things, and this is why it's rather useful. This is a good practice example because a strong methodology was applied across 28 sites. So if you aggregate all the information together, Diageo gets the big numbers. More than 1.6 million people have benefited to date. That's on your top right. So you've got some quantitative big picture for communication. But because it goes into detail, you also get the best practice and the challenges. So it's very good for decision making, for improving, because you get more detailed information on what works in terms of community ownership and sustainability. So to summarise the strengths and weaknesses of this approach, the strengths are that it can combine the financial with other kinds of data relative to poverty. It can combine description with explanation, and it's based very much on local reality. It's got that validity coming from what stakeholders say. But its strengths are also its weaknesses. It's hard to apply on a large scale. You can apply to lots of places and scale up just the quantitative bits, but there comes a point at which scale is a problem. So that brings us to our second approach, which is really an attempt to build on some of the advantages first, but draw them up into, aggregate them into some bigger picture which relates to the value chain. So the second approach is value chain footprinting. By value chain, we mean everything going from extraction of raw materials, manufacturing, processing, production, to distribution, retail, and sometimes recycling. Hopefully always recycling. And footprint can relate to just financial flows tracking through the local economy, but really, particularly in the Oxfam version that Oxfam are doing, something more about social and poverty impacts. So you can, again, you combine the financial with the social and other issues. This value chain approach, it looks at each component of the value chain and then it aggregates it up into the value chain. So you get the local disaggregated information and the big picture. The best known example is, of course, the Unilever Indonesia work, which we will hear about. And I think most of us already know how that helped to highlight the extremities of the value chain, the supply, and particularly the retail and the distribution chain, the value of those. And that's one advantage of this approach, it makes those parts of the business no longer invisible. It's useful for informing decision-making in several ways. Value chain analyses have been done in tourism as well, and in fact several have been done. And the information for improving practice comes from three sources. One is the disaggregated analysis of a particular product, like the Cat Bongo in the Unilever work, or analysis of the craft chain somewhere. The other is from the big picture that you get comparing across the chain, as I said, highlighting where supply or distribution or in particular the food sector and the tourism industry are really important for impact on the poor. And the third, once you've done enough, is you can get comparisons with other businesses or other destinations and start getting benchmarks. In this example, information from the Gambia was compared with Egypt, Uganda, Mozambique and Ethiopia, and it showed where the real high pro-poor impact from the Gambia was coming because the 7 companies from the UK who send their clients are spending money on shopping and excursions, and these are relatively pro-poor, and that's where the impact comes. So you start getting a sense of comparison once you've done a few, which does not apply in approach 1. So to summarise the strengths and weaknesses of this, again it combines lots of data and it combines the local into a big picture. It's good for core business, not really for a CSR project that gets to grips with the heart of business. It's good for improving, and it does have some big picture results for proving, although they tend to be finely textured. But the information requirements are quite high, and the analytical demands are quite high. I think doing this one badly is probably worse than not doing it at all. The third approach is one that assesses the economic contribution of a business. And there are a couple of well-known examples here also from SAB Miller's work in South Africa and Unilever's work in South Africa, which calculated the economic contribution to GDP. Like the value chain work, they look at the whole business, not at a project, and they include the supply and distribution chains. The difference is they tend to focus on economic impact rather than other aspects of poverty or social impact. There's less disaggregation, although the different parts of the business are covered. And the tools are quite different. They tend to use economic tools, multipliers and input-output tables. They deliver very clear outputs. I love this quote from Ethan Kapstein, who is the author of the South Africa study. He says the whole point is to get away from anecdote and hearsay. I'm going to give you hard numbers. And boy, they do that. This study showed that Unilever's contribution to South Africa's GDP was almost 1%, SAB's contribution around 3%, and tourism sector has done umpteen of these called satellite accounts, because tourism doesn't appear in the national accounts. And around the world, people are waving these figures at ministries of finance saying, look, in this case, Namibia, tourism contributes 13.9% of GDP, which I know from the chair of the Namibian Tourism Board was very effective in talking to the Ministry of Finance. Had a hitherto unrecognised impact. So, in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of this approach, it gives hard data and it gives the big picture in the national context. It's really speaking to people about the context within which the company operates. Value added. So it is useful for proving, and it focuses on business, not just on the CSR agenda. And the approach is scalable, it's replicable, and it's comparable. On the downside, it's less on stakeholder views and other poverty impacts and less disaggregation, and it's more descriptive than explanatory. Why? So therefore it's harder to know why something is big or small and how to increase it. The final approach, from what I've said already, it's quite clear that nothing is perfect. No single indicator will ever capture the development value that you want to know. So the obvious solution is to have a scorecard, a balanced scorecard, have different categories, have your financial, have your social, have your institutional, have your whatever. And this is an approach that in fact many companies do use in the sense of GRI reporting, which has a whole load of indicators and a whole load of categories. But GRI reporting actually has very little on the impacts, the contribution of the company to development. Some of these economic performance indicators touch on it, but it doesn't go into depth. But other organisations are using this scorecard approach to try and capture scorecards that do better reflect the contribution to development. A few different ones are here. The top one is actually IFC, but the same principle is used by most of the development banks. They look at, of course, they look at financial return, of course they look at economic performance, of course they look at environmental. What I really like here is they have a category that's about dynamic effects. In IFC it's private sector development, others call it transformational, demonstration effects. That they're looking, and really you could argue that these impacts of a company in an economy are just as important as the immediate, direct ones. So it's an approach that captures the quantitative data, but also has a nice category about these intangible but very important impacts. The other ones here, one is used by a company to assess its suppliers against sustainability. That was in a project briefing from the last meeting, the SPHERE approach. And the other is Aspire, which is out there, not just with paper, but with a computer to show you the new Aspire approach, which assesses projects on site. So, strengths and weaknesses of this approach. It simplifies complexity. And the complex issues can be really quite complex, including this category of dynamic. But the simplification is also great. They're wonderfully visual, as you could see, and they're comparable, and you can track change over time. So it does both those very well. But of course, a shell is only a shell. It's a framework for putting data in. So the question is, what's the data, what are the indicators that you put in there? And as the work that ODI and others are doing on the Good for Development approach, the key challenge there is about how do you find indicators that measure what is good for development. So that's the challenge on this one, putting the right things in. And also it is descriptive rather than explanatory. So there is more information in the framework paper that's on the web and will be revised into a working paper. There's a little bit more in the handouts that you've got. There's a lot of detail in there. But to try and give a quick, broad summary before we get to our speakers who will look in more detail at actual experience. What's useful depends on what you want to do, quite obviously. If a company wants information for improving, well, approach one is going to give good information, a mixture of views and causality and good practice and social and financial at site level or at a specific level. Approach 2 will do it at site level and across the chain, and it may have potential also to increase, may have potential for looking at areas that increase impact and comparisons. Approach 3 will show areas of high and low impact, but not necessarily a lot more detail of why. approach 4, it will show also areas of high and low performance in terms of scores, and you can track changes over time. Won't go into great detail about how that impact is delivered. So they can all do something in a different way. If the aim is to prove, to communicate to stakeholders, again, they will all deliver something slightly different. The first one will prove with human stories and some quantitative data. The second one will prove with some big picture data and some finely textured analysis underneath that. The third one will give the hard data, the big picture, the GDP contribution and the 300,000 jobs. And the fourth one, you can communicate your scores, be they high, or be they improving, or be they better than others. On the other hand, a score is only a score, and a score itself isn't quite as powerful as some of the other data or human scores. So, conclusion, but we're only not far into our meeting, is a fairly obvious one. But the choice of approach depends on your business case for assessment, why you're doing it, and how you're going to use the findings. So we're now going to ask our speakers to touch on their experience and why they did it, and how they use their findings. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any reason why you shouldn't do all of them?
I think people are going to say, why should I do any of them? They're too much work. So to do all of them would probably be commercial.